Have you ever reached a point in your relationship where you stopped bringing something up, not because it stopped bothering you, but because you were tired of repeating yourself? At first, you tried to explain. Then you tried again and again. But somewhere along the way, the conversation started feeling pointless, and the silence started feeling easier than another argument. Or maybe your experience was slightly different. Maybe you reached a moment where you were about to ask a question about something that bothered you, something you noticed, something that didn't feel right. But before the words even left your mouth, you stopped yourself. Not because the question disappeared, but because a quiet thought crossed your mind. Is there even any point bringing this up again? This moment happens more often than people admit. Someone notices something that hurts, something confusing, something that keeps repeating itself. But instead of starting another difficult conversation, they swallow the words. Not because they don't care, but because they've already imagined how the conversation will go. Maybe it will turn into another argument. Maybe they'll be misunderstood again. Maybe they'll be told they're overreacting. Maybe the discussion will end the same way the previous ones did, with nothing really changing. So instead, they stay quiet. And over time, those unasked questions slowly turn into silent thoughts. In many relationships, resentment doesn't begin with silence. It begins with someone trying very hard to be heard. And over time, when those attempts feel ignored, misunderstood, or dismissed, the person who once spoke the most may slowly become the quietest. In this video, we're going to uncover the silent resentment cycle inside many relationships, why it develops, why some partners stop speaking about certain issues entirely, and how emotional distance in marriage often grows from conversations that were tried many times before they were finally abandoned. Whether you're already married or still hoping to build a lasting relationship someday, understanding this pattern can completely change how you see communication, emotional signals in relationships, and the warning signs that couples often overlook. Welcome to Unspoken in Marriage, where we uncover the hidden psychology behind love, silence, and the misunderstandings that shape every relationship. Number 1. When repeating yourself starts feeling like nagging. In many relationships, resentment does not begin with anger. It begins with repetition. One partner notices something that bothers them. Maybe it's the way a concern keeps being brushed aside. Maybe it's feeling unheard during discussions. Maybe it's feeling like certain needs are constantly being minimized. So naturally, they bring it up. Then they bring it up again and again, not because they enjoy repeating themselves, but because they care enough to hope things can improve. Psychology often shows that when people repeat concerns in relationships, it usually comes from a desire to protect the connection. They are trying to repair something before it becomes a deeper problem. But when those repeated attempts are met with irritation, dismissal, or labels like complaining or nagging, something important begins to happen emotionally. The person who is trying to fix the problem slowly begins to feel like the problem. And that can be a painful shift, because what started as an attempt to strengthen the relationship suddenly feels like criticism or annoyance in the eyes of the other partner. In many marriages, this is one of the earliest emotional signals in relationships that resentment may begin forming. Not because someone wanted to create conflict, but because someone cared enough to keep trying to talk about something that mattered. Number 2. When talking stops feeling safe. At first, partners usually try to solve problems through conversation. They explain their feelings. They try to clarify misunderstandings. They hope the other person will eventually understand their perspective. But sometimes those conversations don't lead to resolution. Instead, they lead to arguments, defensiveness, or feeling misunderstood again. After enough of those experiences, the brain starts making an emotional calculation. Is this conversation actually helping, or is it just exhausting? And slowly, a new behavior appears. Less talking, not because the issue disappeared, but because the emotional cost of discussing it has become too high. This is one of the most misunderstood silent relationship problems. From the outside, it may look like someone suddenly stopped caring. But often the opposite is true. They cared deeply for a long time. They simply stopped believing the conversation would change anything. And when communication stops feeling emotionally safe, partners may start choosing peace over expression, which can look calm on the surface, but underneath, unresolved emotions continue building. If these psychological patterns feel familiar, consider subscribing to Unspoken in Marriage. Because many relationship warning signs don't appear through loud conflict, they appear through silence. Number 3. When resentment grows beyond talking. One of the most difficult phases in many relationships is when resentment grows beyond the stage of conversation. This happens when a partner has already tried expressing the same concern many times. They explained. They argued. They pleaded. They tried different ways of communicating. But over time, nothing seemed to change. Eventually, something shifts internally. Instead of trying to convince the other person again, they stop trying. Not because the issue stopped hurting, but because they no longer believe talking will create a different outcome. This is a powerful psychological moment, because when resentment reaches this stage, silence is no longer just avoidance. It becomes emotional protection. The person begins focusing more on their own internal peace. They may decide that constant arguments are no longer worth the emotional drain, so they choose quiet, not as punishment, but as survival. In many marriages, this is when emotional distance in marriage begins to solidify. The couple may still live together, still function as partners, but the emotional openness that once existed begins shrinking. And sometimes both partners sense that something has changed, even if neither of them fully understands when it happened. Number 4. Living together but protecting your own peace. When resentment continues unresolved long enough, some couples enter a phase where both partners begin protecting their own emotional space. Arguments become less frequent, but not because the issues were resolved. Instead, both people may quietly learn which topics to avoid. They stop bringing up sensitive subjects. They stop challenging certain behaviors. They simply focus on maintaining daily life. Work, responsibilities, children, schedules. In many households across Western cultures, this phase can look surprisingly normal from the outside. The couple still functions together, but internally, the relationship begins operating more like a quiet partnership than an emotionally connected bond. Sometimes this happens consciously, sometimes unconsciously, but the psychological pattern is very common. When emotional battles feel unwinnable, people often choose emotional distance instead, not out of hatred, but out of exhaustion. And while this may reduce daily conflict, it can also create a deeper kind of loneliness inside the relationship. Number 5. The emotional disconnection phase. When silence and emotional distance continue long enough, another stage in the resentment cycle often appears. Emotional disconnection. This is the phase where partners may still respect each other, but the emotional warmth that once existed feels harder to access. Small things start changing. You stop sharing random thoughts during the day. You stop texting each other little updates. You stop discussing feelings because it feels unnecessary or unsafe. The relationship begins running more on routine than emotional connection. Dinner, bills, schedules, responsibilities. Many couples in long-term marriages quietly enter this stage without realizing it. It's not loud. It doesn't look dramatic. But the emotional intimacy that once made the relationship feel alive slowly fades into the background. Number 6. Staying together for practical reasons. Another reality in modern relationships is that people do not always leave when emotional disconnection appears. There are many reasons couples remain together. Children, financial stability, shared responsibilities, cultural values, years of shared life. In these situations, the relationship may continue even while emotional closeness has faded. Partners may shift into a cooperative lifestyle. They raise children together, manage life together, but emotionally, the connection may feel different from what it once was. Psychology does not always interpret this as failure. Sometimes relationships evolve into different forms over time. However, it does reveal something important. Resentment that remains unresolved rarely disappears on its own. Instead, it often changes the emotional shape of the relationship. And if couples hope to rebuild connection, awareness of these silent shifts becomes essential, because emotional distance is rarely created overnight. It is built slowly through moments that felt too small to address until they became too heavy to ignore. Number 7. The moment someone quietly gives up trying. One of the final emotional stages in the silent resentment cycle is not explosive conflict. It's quiet resignation. This is the moment when someone internally decides, I'm done trying to fix this. Not necessarily done with the relationship, but done trying to change certain patterns. In many relationships, this decision does not mean the person has stopped caring about the marriage or the partnership. Often it simply means they have reached the point where they no longer believe certain issues can be changed through the same conversations they have already tried many times before. They stop raising certain concerns. They stop hoping certain behaviors will change. They adjust emotionally instead. They focus more on protecting their own peace. From the outside, this can look like calm acceptance. In some households, it may even look like the relationship has become quieter, more stable, less confrontational. But psychologically, something important has happened. The emotional fight that once existed has ended. For a long time before this stage, the person may have been trying to repair the relationship. They may have been repeating concerns, explaining feelings, asking for change, trying different ways to be understood. When those efforts repeatedly fail, the mind eventually adapts. Instead of continuing the emotional struggle, it lowers its expectations. This is not always a conscious decision. Often it is simply emotional fatigue. Psychology describes this stage as a form of protective withdrawal. The person is not trying to punish their partner. They are trying to protect themselves from continued disappointment. And this is why silent resentment can be so complex. Because the person who becomes quiet was often the one who cared enough to speak the most in the beginning. But over time, repeated emotional frustration slowly reshape their behavior. And in marriages especially, if partners are not emotionally mature enough to recognize what is happening at this stage, the situation can sometimes move in a more painful direction. Because when silent resentment reaches this level, the emotional distance can begin to feel permanent. If both partners are not emotionally prepared to pause, reflect, and rebuild understanding, frustration can quietly turn into the belief that the relationship itself may no longer be repairable. This is one of the psychological moments where thoughts of divorce can begin forming in a marriage. Not always because love completely disappeared, but because unresolved resentment made the relationship feel emotionally exhausting. Sometimes couples reach this point after years of repeating the same unresolved conflicts. The conversation stopped not because the issues disappeared, but because both partners began believing the discussions would never change anything. At that stage, the relationship may still continue outwardly. The couple may still live together, raise children, manage responsibilities, share routines, but emotionally, something essential has shifted. The relationship is no longer driven by hope for change. It is driven by adaptation. And once someone reaches this stage, rebuilding emotional connection often requires intentional effort from both partners. Because the silence is no longer temporary. It has slowly become the new normal. And breaking that silence often requires something different from what was tried before. Not louder arguments, not forcing conversations, but rebuilding emotional safety around communication. Psychology shows that when partners feel safe expressing themselves without being dismissed or attacked, conversations begin to change. Instead of repeating the same arguments, couples start exploring the emotional experiences behind them. Instead of defending positions, they begin understanding perspectives. And that shift is often the first step toward healing resentment that once felt permanent. Because even when silent resentment has existed for years, awareness can still reopen the possibility of connection. Not instantly, not magically, but gradually. Sometimes it begins with one honest conversation. Sometimes it begins with one partner choosing curiosity instead of defensiveness. And sometimes the most powerful shift happens when both partners finally acknowledge the silence that has been growing between them. Because silence inside relationships is rarely empty. It is usually filled with emotions that were never fully understood. So if parts of this cycle felt familiar while listening today, remember this. Awareness is not the end of a relationship story. Often, it is the beginning of understanding what was happening beneath the surface all along. If this conversation helped you see relationships in a new light, consider subscribing to Unspoken in Marriage and staying connected with this channel. Because many of the most important lessons about love, communication, and emotional intelligence in relationships are rarely taught, yet they shape the success or failure of countless marriages. And in the next video, we're going to explore another powerful dynamic many couples notice. Why one partner often seems to understand the relationship more deeply than the other. Why one person notices emotional distance earlier. Why one person keeps trying to talk about problems while the other seems unaware. Understanding that dynamic can completely change how couples approach communication, emotional awareness, and long-term connection. Because sometimes the partner who notices the problems first is not the one who loves more. They are simply the one who started recognizing the emotional signals earlier. And when both partners begin understanding those signals together, something powerful becomes possible. Healing. Renewed understanding. and the chance for love to grow stronger instead of quietly fading. So stay tuned, subscribe, and continue this journey of understanding the hidden psychology behind love, silence, and the emotional patterns that shape every relationship.